They said the logs on his roof were pointless, a fool's monument to grief. According to territorial records from Laramie County, what happened during the Great Freeze of 1878 would prove them all wrong, exposing a survival secret that changed frontier construction forever. But before we get to the blizzard that nearly wiped a settlement off the map, you need to understand the tragic reasons Silas built that cabin in the first place. It started with a promise made over a frozen grave. The autumn air bit deep into Silas's bones. He stood before his half-finished cabin in the Medicine Bow Range, a structure that was already the subject of quiet mockery. His immediate goal was to set the last of the massive roof logs before the first heavy snows locked the high country in ice. The obstacle was the sun, already sinking behind the peaks, and the crushing weight of the timbers themselves. If he failed, if winter caught him with an open roof, he would face the same brutal end as his younger brother, Caleb. Silas wrapped his chilled hands around the thick rope of his pulley system. The log, a monster of a lodgepole pine nearly 16 inches thick, swayed precariously. It was one of 60 such logs that formed his roof, a structure thicker than the cabin's own walls. Other settlers used thin poles and sod, a roof you could build in 2 days. Silas had spent 2 months on his. A local trapper named Jedediah had stopped by last week, looked at the absurdly heavy roof, and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. He'd called it Silas's Folly. The name had stuck. But what Jedediah didn't know was the secret Silas carried. A memory of a different cabin, one built the conventional way. The memory was from the winter before. He and Caleb had built their first cabin in a week, proud of their speed. The land deed carries an old stamp, U.S. Land Office 1877, a testament to their shared dream. It was a standard cabin, tight walls, but a light, quick roof. According to wilderness survival expert Dr. Eris Thorne, a historian specializing in frontier life, the most common point of failure in these early structures was the roof. They provided shelter from precipitation, but offered almost zero thermal insulation. That January, a cold snap had descended. Caleb had caught a lung fever. He was too weak to keep the fire roaring through the night. The heat bled out through the thin roof as if it wasn't there at all. Silas had woken to a deadly silence, the fire dead, and his brother still, forever cold under his blankets. Caleb's last journal entry, now logged in the Laramie County archives, reads simply, "The cold comes from above." That was the promise Silas had made. He would build a cabin that held the warmth, a fortress against the killing cold that fell from the sky. He strained, his muscles screaming as the final log lifted, inch by agonizing inch. It settled into place with a groan that seemed to shake the entire structure. The roof was complete. The real test, however, was just beginning. Anyone who has spent a winter at 9,000 feet knows the cold is a living thing. It finds every crack, every weakness, with a patient, relentless pressure. The cabin stood ready. Silas spent the first weeks of winter in a state of quiet observation. His routine was unlike any other homesteaders in the valley. Each evening he would build a strong, hot fire for a few hours. He cooked his meal, read a chapter from an old book, and let the heat fill the small space. The interior logs of his thick roof would grow warm to the touch. Then around 9 o'clock, he would let the fire burn down to embers. In any other cabin, this was the moment the danger began. But in Silas's Folly, something remarkable happened. The cold was held at bay. He would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, hours after the fire had died, and the air would be cool, but not frigid. He could see his breath, but his water bucket had only a thin film of ice, not a solid block. The official incident report from a later event, filed under case number 1878 CR 112, would note this phenomenon. It states, the structure maintained an interior temperature approximately 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the exterior ambient temperature for up to 8 hours without an active heat source. Silas would place his hand on the ceiling logs. They radiated a gentle, persistent warmth back into the room. They had become a battery, storing the fire's energy and releasing it slowly through the night. It was working. His firewood pile, stacked twice as high as he thought he'd need, was shrinking at half the rate of his neighbors. Thomas Miller, who had a homestead 2 miles down the creek, stopped by one afternoon. His cabin was a drafty box. his wife and 2 young children constantly huddled by a fire that devoured wood at an alarming rate. "Don't know how you do it, Silas," Thomas said, shivering even inside Silas's cabin. "We're burning through our cordwood like it's grass." Silas simply pointed up. "It's the roof," he said. Thomas looked at the ceiling, then back at Silas with a puzzled expression, not yet understanding the principle. He saw pointless weight. Silas knew it was a reservoir of warmth. The mockery from men like Jedediah softened into grudging curiosity. They still called it the folly, but now there was a question in their tone. The structure had survived the first heavy snows without collapsing, defying their predictions. What they couldn't see was the quiet vindication Silas felt each morning. He was surviving. More than that, he was comfortable. But a mild December was one thing. The true architect of life and death in the Rockies, the brutal, unpredictable January, was yet to come. And then the sky turned a strange, dark gray. The real story was about to unfold. Pay attention to this detail. It becomes crucial later. The change in weather wasn't just a storm, it was a fundamental shift in the atmosphere, something the Arapaho called the Blue Norther. The Great Freeze of 1878 began on the 10th of January. It wasn't a blizzard of snow, but a tidal wave of pure Arctic cold. National Weather Service historical data confirms the event, showing a temperature drop of over 60 degrees in less than 12 hours across Wyoming and Colorado territories. By nightfall, the thermometer outside Silas's cabin, a novelty he'd bought in Cheyenne, read 35 degrees below zero. The wind howled like a ghost, stripping heat from every surface. For the settlers in the valley, it was a catastrophic event. Their conventional cabins, designed for ordinary winters, were failing. At the Miller homestead, the situation was desperate. Despite a fire roaring so hot it threatened to crack the stone hearth, the cold poured through their thin roof. Frost formed on the walls inside the cabin. Their youngest child, a 4-year-old girl named Clara, was shivering uncontrollably, her lips turning a pale shade of blue. Thomas and his wife Mary piled every blanket they owned on their children, but they knew it was a losing battle. The cold was winning. In his panic, Thomas remembered his odd neighbor. He remembered the strange, quiet warmth in Silas's cabin on a merely cold day. He remembered the massive, pointless roof. "I'm going to Silas's," he told Mary, his voice tight with fear. It's a crazy idea, but his cabin felt different, warmer. Mary begged him not to go. The 2-mile journey in this cold was a death sentence, but staying was also a death sentence. It was a choice between a certain end and a desperate hope. Have you ever faced a moment where the only choice was to risk everything? This was that moment for Thomas Miller. He wrapped himself in every layer he had, took a lantern that barely illuminated the swirling ground snow, and stepped out into the lethal cold. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. His beard froze solid in minutes. He stumbled, fell, and crawled, navigating by the faint memory of the creek bed. He later described the experience in a letter to his sister, an artifact now held by the Wyoming State Museum. He wrote, "I was certain I was walking to my grave. The only thing that kept me moving was the image of my little Clara's face." After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint, square shape against the darkness. Silas's cabin. He collapsed against the door, his hands too numb to knock properly, and used the last of his strength to shout. The door swung open instantly. The contrast was staggering. Silas stood there in a simple wool shirt, no coat. Behind him, the cabin was filled not with roaring heat, but with a calm, steady warmth. A small fire of just 2 logs glowed in the hearth, more for light than for heat. Thomas tumbled inside, gasping, the life-saving warmth enveloping him. It felt, he would later say, like stepping into a different season. "My family," he stammered, his words slurring from the cold. "They're freezing. Our cabin. It's like being outside." Silas didn't ask questions. He grabbed his heaviest buffalo coat, a sled he used for hauling wood, and a stack of pre-warmed soapstones. Without a word of hesitation, he was ready to go back out into the storm. What happened next would change not just the Miller family's fate, but the entire community's understanding of survival. The pointless roof was about to become a legend. Anyone listening in the dark feels the warmth hold steady. That is the feeling Thomas Miller had when he entered that cabin, a feeling of impossible safety against a world of killing cold. The rescue was a brutal affair. Silas, hardened by years of solitary labor, led the way, his larger frame breaking a path through the wind-whipped snow. Thomas followed, his strength slowly returning in the wake of his neighbor's quiet determination. It took them over an hour to cover the 2 miles back to the Miller cabin. When they arrived, the scene was grim. The fire was nearly dead, the last of their wood consumed. Mary was huddled over her children, trying to shield them with her own body. The air inside was dangerously cold. Silas worked with a methodical calm. He used the warm soapstones to create a pocket of heat under the children's blankets, while he and Thomas brought them out to the sled. The trip back to Silas's cabin was even more harrowing, pulling the sled with its precious cargo against the relentless wind. When they finally stumbled back inside Silas's folly, it was like a sanctuary. The interior was still comfortably warm, the thermal mass of the massive log roof steadily radiating the heat it had stored hours earlier. Mary Miller wept with relief, feeling the deep, penetrating chill finally begin to recede from her children's small bodies. They spent 3 days in Silas's cabin as the great freeze held the mountains in its grip. During that time, a profound truth became clear. Silas's cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a system. He used a fraction of the firewood, yet his home remained a bastion of warmth and life, while modern, efficiently built cabins had become iceboxes. The Trading Post ledger from that spring shows 3 family names from that valley struck from the rolls, listed as perished in the freeze. The Millers were not among them. The crate that held their few remaining supplies bears a faint stencil from the Union Pacific Railroad, a reminder of the life they almost lost. When the cold snap finally broke, news of the Miller family's rescue and the miracle of Silas's cabin spread through the valley. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was evidence. Jedediah, the old trapper who had named the folly, was the first to visit. He walked in, looked around, and placed a calloused hand on the ceiling. He felt the faint, residual warmth. He stood there for a long moment, the silence thick with unspoken meaning. "I was wrong, Silas," he said, his voice low. "I don't rightly understand it, but I was wrong." He had seen proof. A cabin could be more than a barrier. It could be a storehouse for heat. The ridicule turned into respect, and respect turned into imitation. That spring, 5 new cabins were built in the valley. All of them had thick, heavy, stacked log roofs. The technique, once called Silas's folly, was now being called the warm roof, or more simply, the Silas method. The truth was more powerful than any mockery. The quietest voices often carry the solutions people need most. What Silas had discovered through grief and sheer will was a principle of physics. He had built a passive heat retention system. The legacy of that discovery was just beginning. The years that followed saw the Silas method spread far beyond that single valley. Homesteaders arriving on the newly opened rail lines heard stories of the warm roof cabins. According to the journals of Alistair Finch, a surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad in the 1880s, a peculiar style of construction is noted in the settlements west of the Laramie Plains. The cabins are distinguished by roof structures of immense weight, composed of layered logs. Settlers claim these structures significantly reduce fuel consumption and increase survivability during harsh winters. This was no longer a personal obsession, it was becoming established regional knowledge. Anders Eriksson, a Swedish immigrant, built a homestead for his family of 5 using the design. His construction logs, obtained through public records, show he spent nearly an entire summer on the roof alone. But his letters home, preserved by the American-Swedish Institute, tell the story of the payoff. He wrote, "Our first winter was a gentle one, not because of the weather, which was fierce, but because of our home. The children sleep soundly through the night, and the fire rests as we do. We are safe from the cold that took so many of our neighbors. The design saved fuel, but more importantly, it provided peace of mind." Silas himself never sought credit. He was a quiet man, driven by a private memory. He helped his neighbors draw up plans. He showed them how to rig the pulleys to lift the heavy logs, but he never called it his own. He was content to see the warmth spread. He had honored his promise to his brother, Caleb. He had fought back against the cold that comes from above. His innovation wasn't born from genius, but from love and loss. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound solutions come not from grand ambition, but from the simple, determined refusal to let tragedy have the final word. Decades later, long after Silas had passed on and the valley had grown into a town, architectural historians would study the remains of these early structures. They would marvel at the over-engineered roofs, initially dismissing them as inefficient and wasteful. But analysis of territorial weather data, alongside settlement survival rates, revealed a stunning correlation. Communities with a higher concentration of warm-roof cabins had demonstrably lower winter mortality rates. The logs had never been pointless. They were silent guardians, a legacy of warmth built by a quiet mountain man who had turned his deepest grief into a gift of life for generations to come.